He trusts us, Emeka said, smiling into his cup of palm wine. That is the only weapon we need. What the three brothers did not know, as they sat planning in the dark that night, was that the same trust they were about to destroy would one day be the very thing that destroyed them. But that day was still 6 years away. Tonight, they had a plantation to steal. To understand how three brothers stole an empire from their own nephew, you must first understand the bitterness that had been growing in their hearts for over 20 years, long before Okonkwo ever died by that stream. Obiora, Emeka, and Chuka had grown up in the same compound as Okonkwo, eating from the same pot, sharing the same father. But from childhood, something had always set Okonkwo apart. He was the one who woke before sunrise without being called. He was the one who finished his portion of the farm work and then quietly finished his brother's portions too, never mentioning it, never holding it over them. Teachers favored him, elders praised him, girls in the village whispered his name with admiration that none of his brothers ever received. Their father, recognizing this difference, made a decision that would poison the family for generations. When he divided his small parcel of land among his 4 sons before he died, he gave Okonkwo the best portion, the section closest to the stream with the richest soil, because he will make the most of it, and what he makes, he will share with all of you. Okonkwo did exactly that. For years he shared his harvest, his profits, his success generously, without complaint, but generosity given freely is rarely received with gratitude forever. Over time, Obiora, Emeka, and Chuka stopped seeing Okonkwo's gifts as kindness. They began to see them as proof of an old debt, a debt they believed the universe owed them, simply for being his brothers. He only has what he has because Father loved him more, Obiora would mutter, after another failed business Okonkwo had quietly funded. It should have been split between all of us from the beginning. By the time Okonkwo died, this resentment had calcified into something colder and more dangerous than jealousy. It had become a plan. The plan did not begin the day after the funeral as it might have appeared to Emeka. It began nearly 2 years before Okonkwo's death, in a quiet meeting at Chuka's apartment in the city. A meeting Okonkwo never knew took place. Chuka had a friend from his years working in real estate in the city, a businessman named Mr. Adigwe, who specialized in buying agricultural land cheaply and reselling it to large cocoa exporters at enormous profit. Chuka described his brother's plantation to Mr. Adigwe in detail. 30 years of established cocoa trees, prime soil near a reliable stream, well maintained, already supplying several local buyers. That land, Mr. Adigwe said, leaning back in his chair, if it ever became available, I could move it within a month. Cocoa exporters are desperate for established plantations right now. Building new ones takes 7 years before the trees even produce properly. Established land like this is worth 3-4 times what raw land would cost. I would pay handsomely to you personally for arranging it. It is not available, Chuka said carefully. My brother owns it. He is in good health. Mr. Adigwe simply smiled. Men are not in good health forever, my friend. Keep my number. Chuka did not act on this conversation immediately, but he did not forget it either. He brought it to Obiora and Emeka soon after, and the 3 brothers began slowly and carefully building the foundation for what they would eventually do. Step 1 was the lawyer. Emeka found him, a desperate young attorney named Barrister Ayres, freshly graduated, deeply in debt from law school, willing to draft documents that bent the truth in exchange for a generous fee and the promise of future business from an influential family. Emeka paid him to draft a document months in advance, the same document that would eventually appear at Emeka's table on the 8th day after the funeral. They could not predict exactly when Okonkwo would die, but they wanted to be ready the moment it happened. Step 2 was patience. The brothers waited. They continued visiting Okonkwo's compound for family gatherings, smiling, eating his food, accepting his generosity, all while privately hoping in the ugliest corner of their hearts that their moment would eventually come. It came on a rainy Tuesday when Okonkwo's heart simply stopped by the edge of his own stream. The brothers' grief at the funeral, witnessed by the entire village, was not entirely false. Even cruel men can feel something at the death of a brother they grew up with. But underneath that grief, a colder calculation was already running. Within hours of learning of Okonkwo's death, before the body had even been prepared for burial, Chuka made a phone call to Mr. Adigwe in the city. "It's happening," was all he said. For the next 7 days, while the village mourned and Emeka organized the burial rites his father deserved, the three brothers prepared. Ikenna contacted Barrister East to finalize the document, adjusting only the dates. Obiora began researching exactly how the local land registry worked, identifying which clerk in the district office could be convinced, with a modest bribe, to process the transfer of the management committee's authority without raising questions about how recently it had been signed. Chuka kept Mr. Adigwe updated, promising the plantation would be available for purchase within weeks of the funeral concluding. They knew Emeka would be exhausted, they knew he would be grieving, trusting, and vulnerable, and they used every single one of those things deliberately, the way a hunter studies the weakest point in an animal's defense. On the 8th day, as Emeka has already told you, they came with the document. They watched him sign page by page, never once explaining the clause buried on page 7, the clause that transferred 80% of all decision-making power and profit to the committee. 3 days after Emeka signed, Mr. Adigwe arrived at the plantation, introduced by Chuka simply as a business associate evaluating the land's condition. Emeka, still grieving and trusting his uncle's guidance, had no reason to suspect the visit was anything other than what they claimed, a routine assessment to help the committee plan the next harvest season. Within 2 weeks, the sale was finalized. Mr. Adigwe paid the three uncles directly, not Emeka, a sum that was, by the lawyer's careful wording in the contract, technically committee proceeds to be distributed according to committee discretion. The actual sale price was less than 1/10 of the plantation's true market value, a number so low that even Mr. Adigwe, a man with no particular conscience about his business, privately considered it the easiest profit of his career. Of that already discounted sum, the three brothers gave Emeka almost nothing, a small portion framed as his fair share as the junior committee member, barely enough to cover a few months of basic expenses. The rest they split 3 ways. Obiora used his share to finally fund a transport business that, this time, succeeded, ironically, the first business of his life to actually work, built entirely on his dead brother's stolen land. Ikenna invested his share quietly, telling no one, slowly growing it through smaller land deals across the district. Always careful, always smiling, always the brother no one suspected of anything. Chuka took his share back to the city, where he and Mr. Adigwe began a formal business partnership, flipping agricultural land from grieving families across multiple villages. Okonkwo's plantation, it turned out, had not been their first such deal. It was simply the most personal one. For 6 years, the scheme held. Emeka, still legally bound by the document he had signed in grief, watched the family's wealth slowly transfer into his uncle's hands piece by piece. The second farmland plot sold for committee expenses. The third plot leased long-term to cover committee debts that never seemed to exist before the lease appeared. He worked the remaining land like a laborer on what should have been his own inheritance, paid a small wage by the very committee meant to protect him. He suspected in his quieter moments that something was deeply wrong, but suspicion without proof against 3 respected older men in a village that valued family hierarchy and elder authority was not enough to act on. Every time he raised a question, his uncles had an answer ready, smooth, reasonable, always slightly more knowledgeable than him, always framed as protecting him from his own inexperience. But schemes built on greed rarely stay perfectly hidden forever. Cracks begin small. The first crack appeared in the 6th year when Barrister Ease, The young lawyer who had drafted the original document, now older, more established, and increasingly uneasy about the deal he had helped engineer years before, was approached by a journalist investigating a pattern of suspicious land sales across the district, including Mr. Adigwe's name appearing repeatedly in registry records under strangely low sale prices. Barrister E said nothing to the journalist that day. But that night, sitting alone in his office, staring at a copy of the original document he still kept locked in his files, the one with the hidden clause on page 7, he felt, for the first time in 6 years, something close to fear. Because if that journalist kept digging, the question would not be whether the scheme would unravel, it would only be when. 6 years of careful lies, 3 brothers' fortunes built on a dead man's trust, and a young man still toiling on land that should have been his. All of it now resting on the conscience of one nervous lawyer and the curiosity of a journalist who had no idea she was about to uncover the biggest betrayal Umoji had ever seen. The knock on Emeka's door came on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind of evening that looked exactly like every other evening of the last 6 years, until a woman he had never met stood on his doorstep holding a folder and said the words that would finally end his uncle's lie. "My name is Amara Nosu. I'm a journalist, and I think your father's land was stolen from you." For 6 years, Emeka had carried a suspicion he could never quite name. He worked the remaining family land like a hired hand on what should have been his own inheritance. Watched plots disappear one by one, under explanations that always sounded reasonable in the moment and hollow in the quiet hours afterward. He had stopped asking his uncle's questions years ago because every question only earned him the same answer, delivered with the same patient, condescending smile. "You are still learning, Emeka. Trust the committee." He did not know that 200 kilometers away, a journalist named Amara Nwosu had spent the last 8 months investigating something she initially believed was a simple pattern of land fraud until she found Okonkwo-Eze's name buried in a registry file attached to a sale price so absurdly low it could only mean one thing. Amara had built her reputation exposing corrupt land deals across 3 states, the kind of investigative work that made powerful people uncomfortable, and ordinary people finally believed someone was paying attention. Her source inside the district land registry had flagged Mr. Adigwe's name months earlier. It appeared on too many suspiciously discounted agricultural land transfers, each one following an eerily similar pattern. A wealthy landowner dies, a family management committee forms almost immediately, and within weeks the land sells to Adigwe at a fraction of his worth. When Amara finally tracked down Barrister Ease, the lawyer who had drafted Emeka's original document, she did not need to threaten him. 6 years of guilt had already done the work for her. Sitting across from her in a quiet cafe, his hands trembling slightly around his coffee cup, the young lawyer, who was no longer quite so young, told her everything. The hidden clause on page 7, the 3 brothers who had paid him to draft it, the rushed signing 8 days after a funeral, the nephew who had trusted his own family completely. "I have a copy," he told her quietly. "I kept it. I told myself it was just good practice, keeping records, but I think some part of me always knew I would need it one day." He handed her a folder. Inside it was the original document, the genuine version, the one Emeka had signed without understanding, with the buried clause clearly visible, dated and notarized, undeniable. Amara found Emeka's village 3 weeks later, after confirming every detail she could verify independently: land registry records, Mr. Adigwe's financial history, even quiet conversations with 2 other families across the district who had lost land in nearly identical schemes, families too afraid or too poor to fight back. When she knocked on Emeka's door that Thursday evening and explained who she was, Emeka's first instinct was disbelief, then anger, not at her, but at himself, for the 6 years he had spent accepting explanations that should never have satisfied him. "Show me," he said simply. Amar spread the documents across his kitchen table, the same table, Emeka realized, with a cold feeling in his chest, where he had once watched his father teach him how to read soil, how to negotiate without losing respect. She walked him through everything: the clause on page 7, the timeline of Mr. Adegwe's land purchases, the suspiciously discounted sale price compared to the plantation's true value, the pattern across multiple families. "This is real," Emeka said quietly, his hands flat on the table to stop them from shaking. "This is actually real. They planned this. Before my father even died, they were already planning this." "I believe so," Amara said gently. "I'm sorry. I know that's a hard thing to learn about your own family." Emeka sat in silence for long moments, staring at his father's old chair across the room. The chair Obiora had taken for himself that first evening, 8 days after the funeral, as though he had already decided whose house this really was. "What do I do with this?" Emeka finally asked. "You have two paths," Amara said. "I can publish this story. It will damage them publicly, badly, and it may pressure them to settle quietly to avoid further exposure. Or you take this directly to court with my documentation supporting your case, and you fight for the land to be legally returned to you. It will take longer, it will be harder, but if you win, it will not just be public shame, it will be the law, undoing what they did permanently." Emeka looked at the document on the table. The same document, the same handwriting, the same signature he had given in grief and trust 6 years before. "I want both," he said. "I want it public, so the whole village knows the truth. And I want it in court, so it can never be undone again." The case took 11 months, barrister ease driven by guilt and the protection Amara's reporting offered him as a cooperating witness, testified fully about the document's creation, admitting under oath that the brothers had commissioned the clause years before Okonkwo's death and had paid him specifically to obscure it within dense legal language designed to be overlooked by a grieving young man. Mr. Adegwe, facing his own exposure across multiple similar land deals throughout the district, chose to cooperate rather than face additional fraud charges, providing financial records that confirmed the plantation's true value and the absurdly low price the brothers had accepted in exchange for keeping the deal quiet and personal. The three brothers did not face their reckoning united. The moment Obiora realized the case was unraveling, he turned on his own brothers in a desperate attempt to reduce his own liability, claiming in his testimony that the scheme had been entirely Ikena's idea and that he himself had merely gone along with it out of family loyalty. Ikena in turn produced records of his own, quiet bank transfers proving Obiora had personally negotiated the bribe to the land registry clerk, the detail Obiora had hoped no one would ever trace back to him. Chuka, watching his two older brothers tear each other apart in testimony after testimony, said almost nothing in court at all, his expensive lawyer instructing him to let his brothers destroy each other while he tried unsuccessfully to remain the quietest target. The same greed that had once bound the three brothers together in a single conspiracy now turned them against one another with equal ferocity. The village of Umoji, watching the case unfold through Amara's published reporting, watched three men who had once stood at their own brother's casket as honored mourners now publicly betray each other to avoid prison. In the end, the court ruled decisively. The original document was declared fraudulent, obtained through deliberate deception of a grieving heir, with clear evidence of premeditation predating Okonkwo's death. Every plot of land, the plantation, the two additional farmland sections, sold under false committee expenses, and the compound itself was legally restored to Emeka as the sole rightful heir of Okonkwo Eze's estate. Obiora's transport business, built on his share of the stolen plantation money, was seized as part of the restitution judgment. Ikena's quietly accumulated land investments, traced directly back to the original fraud, were similarly forfeited. Chuka, whose business partnership with Mr. Adigwe had expanded their scheme to other families across the district, faced the most serious charges of the three, as evidence emerged that he had personally identified and pursued several of the other victims Amara had documented. A year after the court's ruling, Emeka stood once again at the edge of the cocoa plantation. His cocoa plantation, fully and legally his. The trees his father had planted 30 years before, still standing, still producing, still feeding families across Umoji during harvest season, exactly as Okonkwo always intended. He had used part of the restored wealth to fund something his father would have recognized immediately, a small fund to help other grieving families verify inheritance documents before signing them, working in partnership with Amara's ongoing investigative reporting. He named it simply the Okonkwo Trust. He never spoke to his three uncles again. Obiora and Ikena, stripped of their stolen wealth and publicly disgraced, eventually left Umoji entirely, unable to face a village that now knew exactly what they had done. Chuka served the longest sentence of the three, his city connections and business reputation destroyed beyond repair. Standing at the edge of the stream where his father had died, the same stream, the same plantation, finally and rightfully his again, Emeka understood something he had not fully grasped during the long years of quiet suspicion and even longer months of the trial. His father had not just left him land. He had left him the example of who to become: patient, honest, generous, even when the people closest to him had chosen the opposite. The land had been stolen and recovered, but the values his father raised him with had never been taken from him at all. Those his uncles had never managed to touch.